Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we come to you every Sunday and give you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers throughout the African diaspora talk about their craft, their work, and their lives. I'm very, very pleased and very excited to have on the telephone with me an award winning writer right here in Brooklyn, New York, Jacqueline Woodson. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Oh, good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Jacqueline Woodson is the best selling author of more than 24 award winning books, including the New York Times best-selling memoir Brown Girl Dreaming, which was a wonderful book, and which won the 2014 National Book Award, the Coretta Scott King Award, a Newbery Honor Award, an NAACP Image Award, and the Cybert Honor Award. She was named the Young People's Poet Laureate, among her other titles, and she has a new book, which is her first novel in a long time, or I would say the novel, Another Brooklyn, which I found really, really very moving, and a book that I think many young women can relate to. So thank you again. One of
Oh,
the
thank you.
yeah, one of the themes that's recurring in your books, in all of your books, and in particular in this book is the whole theme around memory. And I'd like you to share with our audience what your earliest memories were of your reading and writing processes, how you came to be a best-selling author, because it was kind of a circuitous turn of events, I would say.
I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was 7, and I've just always loved first the physical act of writing, learning to write my name, and the fact that you put letters together and they made words was kind of amazing to me. And so from a really young age, I was saying I wanted to be a writer, which meant I just wanted the physical act of being able to write words. And then I was always telling stories and getting in trouble for it. And I realized that it was something that I loved doing. So I was a really slow reader and read stuff again and again to try to get a deeper understanding of it. And as a result of all that, and a result of from naming the thing that I wanted to be from a really young age, I became a writer.
Okay, well, I said it was circuitous because you were not the nerdy student. You just loved language and loved, as you said, loved to tell stories.
Mhm.
So, what
Mhm.
was the reaction to when you said you wanted to be a writer? Because part of what ends up moving us along our journey is the kind of support we get from other people.
Yeah, people were doubtful. I mean, I think people were doubtful for a number of reasons because I wasn't this nerdy um, academic. I was more kind of introverted and for a lot of my young life struggling as a student, struggling especially as a reader. And so I think especially teachers were kind of like, well, this doesn't make sense. But also I think they were saying this doesn't make sense because it wasn't kind of the history they knew, like the history of an underserved kid growing up to be a writer. Like you grew up and you got a job and maybe you were a blue collar worker or something, but this wasn't what you were supposed to be dreaming. And so it wasn't reinforced. It wasn't like now where you walk into a school and there are 30 writers in the classroom because they've been they're being taught to write and being called writers. But it was more of a time where teachers were thinking more, quote unquote, realistically about what the future of a young black girl could be. And so at the same time, of course, I had the public library where, because my mom was a single mom, at the end of the school day, we went to the library, which was around the corner from our house, and my mom picked us up when she was done from work.
Okay.
And so from say 3:15 to 5:45, I was surrounded by books, and I was constantly rereading the ones that I love and really studying the authors. And so the message I was getting through the literature was that, of course, you can do this. You know, people have done this before, and then so I was getting a number of messages, and just chose to listen to the ones that made sense to me.
Okay. And you ended up choosing to really focus more of your writing on children's and YA books. Why were you drawn to these age groups?
It's just it was the most important place in my young adulthood, and it's where I have the most memory, and I think it's where it's really important because those are the formative years where young people are beginning to get a sense of who they can become in the world, and or who they're becoming, and so since it was so important to me, I wanted to go back to that place and write from it and mine those memories and write. So even though my work is not necessarily autobiographical, I do have a deep sense of what it means and what it meant to be between the ages of 10 and, say, 16.
Okay, it's interesting that you're saying your work is not autobiographical, but it feels very much autobiographical. Because
Well,
in one way, it seems that it's almost like it's continuing the story of Brown Girl Dreaming.
so you're talking about Another Brooklyn
Yes,
because, you know, I've written 32 books.
yes, exactly,
So,
exactly.
so, so when you look at a lot of my other books, I mean, if we're talking about Brown Girl Dreaming, which is a memoir, of course, that's autobiographical, and then we look at Another Brooklyn, which it's a biography of place, right? It's a biography of Bushwick during the 70s when I was growing up there. But in terms of those four girls, that's not an autobiography. That's a novel. So it's doing Another Brooklyn is doing a couple of things. It's a biography of place. It's a narrative. It's also integrating the part of me that loves poetry. But in terms of those four girls, what I would say I bring to that is emotional autobiography. So even though that wasn't my life, the life that I ascribed to those four girls, I definitely knew the emotions of what it meant to be a teenager and to have good friends and to fall in love for the first time and all the things that happen, a lot of the things that happen. And Another Brooklyn, of course, coming of age, we all experience those things to some extent. And so I bring that emotional autobiography to the narrative in the same way that I do for a book like Miracle Boys, which is about four boys growing up in Upper Manhattan. I mean, about three boys growing up in Upper Manhattan without their parents. I've never been a boy. I've never had to live without my parents, but I know what it's like to grow up. I know what it's like to miss somebody. I know what it's like to have a relative who's diabetic. So it's the integration of what I know and what I feel, but not necessarily what's happened specifically to me.
Yeah, it's interesting, the term emotional autobiography, and I think that's part of why it's so easy as a reader to get into your work. It's
Mhm.
really the universal experience that of what it means to grow up, and
Mhm.
in all of your books, you're able to capture that through young girls and young boys. You're able to really tap
Mhm.
into the emotions. One of the things
Mhm.
that struck me, going back to Another Brooklyn, you open up with, for a long time, my mother wasn't dead yet. Mine could have been a more tragic story. My father could have given in to the bottle or the needle or a woman and left my brother and me to care for ourselves, or worse,
Mhm.
in the care of New York City. And then you said, but this didn't happen. I know that what is tragic isn't the moment, it is the
Mhm.
memory. It is the
Mhm.
memory. How do you capture those memories? What is the process that you use to go back and to capture that emotional those emotional memories? What's the process you use as a writer?
Yeah, I think the fact is I've never forgotten them. So in my brain is all of that and more. And then I listen to music. I look at pictures of the past. I read old magazine articles. I try to get myself back in that place and time. And once I'm there, even more memories come. So, but at the end of the day, it's that they've always been with me, and I tend to compartmentalize until they're needed.
Okay, so just going back, when you're doing this, do you write every day?
No,
So how does that happen? When do you write?
I write when I can. So I write. I try to do something right early every day, like read something as an engaged writer. So I'm reading it to understand the craft of others, how other people write. I'm reading a lot of poetry. Um, I'm rereading some of my old writing. I'm reading stuff out loud to hear if it's working on the page. And I can write when I travel because I have to travel so much. I try to write on the road. I can write in hotel rooms, but I don't beat myself up on the days when I have not written. Sometimes I go for a run in the park and I'm thinking about writing or listening to music that's going to help me get to my writing.
I like
But
that. Yeah.
uh-huh.
No, I was saying I like the idea, the concept of doing something writerly every day,
Mhm.
so that the writing life, the life of the
Yeah.
mind.
Exactly, and it is. It's so for me, writing is like breathing, right? It's what I do, and it's what I can't imagine not doing, and so my life reflects that.
Okay. And one of the going back to the emotional memories, I see your writing and your books as also being very courageous and telling the secrets, those emotions, those fears, those anxieties that we don't always want to share. We're afraid to share. You talk about grief and loss and divorce and depression and teen pregnancy.
Mhm.
Why is this important to share? Why is it important for you to tell these kinds of stories?
So mainly because it's important to know that um, I'm in the world legitimately, that the people I love are in the world legitimately, and I think that's what the narrative does. It legitimizes us in a bigger world and shows us in ourselves in the context of something bigger. And I think the history of those stories not being represented, whether it be because publishers weren't publishing them or people were afraid to write them, I think it's a combination of things. For me, I think one needs to write fearlessly, and you need to not be concerned about what those stories are going to say about you personally, about your people, about your family. I think a lot of times people do not write because they are fearful, and I think this is who the world that I know exists in this way, and I want to put that world on the page so that people who also know this world can meet me in it. And even when I'm thinking about myself as a young writer, the stories that I gravitated toward were the ones where some reflection of me was on the page.
Yeah. Yes. And going back to one of the things that I always say is writing is in one sense autobiographical because it represents all those parts of ourselves.
Mhm.
Well, just following up, you talk about writing fearlessly and writing about what's important and what people might be afraid to say. Do you
Mhm.
believe that writers have a social responsibility? And just to follow that up, as a young black woman writing in this time and age, is there a social responsibility that you have?
I think I can't speak for all writers. I think writers should have a social responsibility, but that doesn't mean they necessarily do. I think there are writers who just write to tell the story or because someone published it. I don't know, but I think in terms of people of color, I don't know any writers of color who don't have a deep social responsibility that they bring to their writing. And across the board, I mean, everybody from picture book writers to people writing adult narratives, I see the way in which they're using their books as a means of telling bigger stories and more important stories. And I mean, I'm looking off the top of my head at something like Last Stop on Market Street by Matt de la Pena, which won the Newbery this year. It was illustrated by Christian Robinson. It's the story of a boy who, with his grandmother, goes to a homeless shelter to feed people, and the boy's like, why don't we have a car? Why do we have to take a bus? Why don't I have that thing that this other? And his grandmother is slowly, steadily moving him toward a greater good, and she's like, this is why. This is what we do. This is who we are. And then the boy's like, wow, this is amazing. And they didn't have to tell that story, right? They could have just told the story of a kid and his grandma taking a bus ride, and maybe they find a dog or something. Who cares? But the idea was, we're going to tell a bigger story. Jason Reynolds, the same thing. And I think that for me, as a writer of color, as a writer who's a woman, it is that need to, as a writer who's queer, there is a need to show reflections of the many people that I love and who have historically been invisible to the world, and let the world come to love them and know them, especially the people who might not ever meet these people in the real world. Like, I think fiction kind of unlocks for people, and it disrupts, right? So part of that disruption is about creating change, and that change is about creating a greater good, and that is social responsibility. So every time I put a character on the page, I'm thinking, okay, what does this mean to the Black boy who sees a reflection of himself in this character? What stereotypes am I reinforcing, or what am I disrupting? And the same for a teenage Black girl, or a young Black woman who's Ivy League educated, or a poor white girl. It is myself questioning my action and questioning how my action is going to impact a world, not just about my action and me. I think I always say I don't write to navel gaze, because that's not going to change the world, but I do write to kind of begin to ask bigger questions.
Yeah, that's very important. Just to follow up, part of what I face as the director of the National Black Writers Conference is the idea of people saying, well, why do we need a Black Writers Conference? We live in a very diverse world. Why do we need a conference that's focused on exposing the work of Black writers and supporting Black writers? What are your thoughts on that?
Because so many conferences don't.
Okay.
And so many conferences might as well say we're conferences that are not for people of color, because we're so minimally represented in them. We get the same thing in the world of children and young adult literature.
Yes.
Why do we need the Coretta Scott King Award? It's because historically the other awards have not recognized our contributions to the canon, and even when they do, it is minimally. So until we get to a world that's truly diverse and integrated, we need these conferences, and we also need those safe spaces where we're not having to explain. Right? And I think people need to understand the value of safe spaces, and I think that's when people get very confused. Like, why am I not invited to this party? Because you're not. Because it's not for you. It's for us to do the work that we need to do to get to a safe place, to get to a better place in a society that has historically not been that for us. So it's so interesting, because I feel like the more I explain, the more impatience I have with having to explain. I mean, I feel like in the 21st century, I shouldn't have to explain why we need the Coretta Scott King Award, or why we need a conference of Black writers, or why we need a women's movement, or why transgender politics need to be talked about. Like, people should understand by this point why these conversations are being had and why these conferences are necessary.
Yes, and you would think, particularly given the turn of events in our world, and you look at what's happening, sometimes I feel like we're going back, because we're still at this process of having to, as you said, having to explain, having to justify. So given that, what message can we give to writers, to aspiring writers? What is the message that you can give to them? How do we continue this work?
I think it's important that writers read. I find that there are a lot of writers that are not reading other writers of color or not seeing the work that has already been done, so that the work that is being done now can continue to be done. I mean, I feel like I can't talk about Another Brooklyn without talking about Zula, talking about Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, or talking about Audre Lorde's the cancer journals even. I think we need to be informed as writers. I also think that, or talking about even, I can't even believe I left this off, James Baldwin's Another Country, which is what the title's playing on, right? So I think that writers also need to, again, not be afraid to tell their stories, and to tell their stories, and not, and so that it's not just their stories, but it is their stories in the context of something bigger. And again, it's so important to just write. I think sometimes, especially with younger writers, they spend so much time questioning the validity of it that it gets in the way of their creative process.
Yeah, one of the issue that keeps coming up in your writing is I was you almost anticipated what I was going to ask you is who are you in conversation with when you're writing? Who are the writers who have influenced you? If we look at this as a
Yeah.
larger conversation, that even goes back to
Uh-huh.
the first novel,
Mhm.
Phyllis Wheatley, or going back to Equiano and his
Mhm.
autobiography. Um,
Mhm.
what is the conversation you are having?
I am definitely having a conversation with Baldwin and um and Lord and Morrison and even Edwige Endicott, like so many writers, and it is a conversation about who we are and where we are now and where are we, how are we trying to get to the next place, and where do we come from, and you know that knowing where we came from part is so integral to where we're going. So it is a constant questioning for me.
Right. Well, when as we coming to a close, you said at the beginning of our conversation how you can go into a classroom now and more people are writing.
Mhm.
What do you see happening as someone who is you have young children in school or teenagers?
Mhm.
What is happening in the school system? What can teachers do? What message can you give to those who are introducing writers to your work?
I think one of the big things that's important is watch how work gets qualified. I find that teachers often will say, this is a book about a boy and his dog, and this is a book about a girl and her dog, and this is a book about a black boy and his dog. And suddenly the blackness becomes the other in the room. And it's so important that we set the tone. I mean, I think it's important that kids know writers of the books are of color, because that message is that you can do this too. Here's Jacqueline Woodson. She's a writer of color. She's from Bushwick. She's it's not, and then, but I think it gets tricky when you qualify characters of some books and not other books, because that's sending a different kind of message. And have that don't be afraid to have the conversation. I know when I wrote Visiting Day, which is a book about a girl whose dad is incarcerated, there was so much pushback from both black and white communities, and the black community was saying, why are we putting this out there? And the white community was saying, we don't have kids like this in our class who have incarcerated parents. And when we look at mass incarceration, of course we all do. And for the kids in the class who felt themselves so isolated because there was so much shame around having an incarcerated parent, and there was no literature out there that dealt for that spoke to them, you know, the minute they saw a mirror of themselves in a book and realized that they were not alone in the world, not only were there other people incarcerated, but the author herself had an incarcerated uncle. So so I think it's important to not have shame when bringing certain books to the classroom, because teachers set the tone, and if they want to foster creative talent in young people, they have to show them the many ways that people have lives in this country and in this world. so that they're not just presenting a single story to their young people, and that's the story the young people think they have to mimic.
Well, I thank you. I think that is a very, very important message, is to always bring that perspective, bring the
Mhm.
context. And
Mhm.
as we close, I think one of the things that comes out, or themes that comes out in all of your work, is the importance of friendship, the importance of having a support system, the importance of
Mhm.
family.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And I want to encourage our readers to go out and purchase the books of Jacqueline Woodson, but particularly Another Brooklyn. I, as I was reading it, I sometimes take notes, and I had said to myself, Another Brooklyn is every young person's journey. It's every person's Brooklyn. It just brought back so many memories. So I thank you for writing that, and I thank you for being courageous and having that sense of responsibility and
Oh,
inspiring young people to write. So thank you, and congratulations on being a having the book be a finalist for the National Book Award, Another Brooklyn, and all of
oh,
the
thank you.
awards and the work that you've done.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Greene, for all of your work. I so appreciate you.
You're welcome. Okay, remember, the writer is always reading, as Jacqueline Woodson tells us. The reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Write me at writers@mec.cuny.edu. I want to thank my production engineer, Fritz, for always being there and being on time and supporting us. And take care. Come back next week. This has been Dr. Brenda Greene, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature and Director of the National Black Writers Conference.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers.